What I want to kind of stress is how we're dealing at the moment with differences in effective regulation of competition policy, that actually the problem appears to be one in regulatory implementation, moving apart, and I want to talk a little bit just about antitrust policy, and then say also something about state aid, which at the European level comes into the competition policy remit. We have at the moment a period of time, I think, in which the interests in competition policy enforcement and regulatory policy are actually drifting apart quite a bit, where the UK is on the more less interventionist, and well, maybe Germany is on the most interventionist end when it comes to the digital economy and kind of ideas that something has to be fixed because there's something problematic about the large digital companies like Google, Amazon, and so on. Is that a matter of different national interests? I don't think, yes, there are just different debates and with different audiences in there. And I think one of the issues really is what is the right objective here to have in terms of kind of going forward and trying to get the best out for the own economy. And the problems that we've been seeing is that although we have the same rules, we've had very different types of enforcements, going even so far that Germany, for example, is now trying to enforce against Facebook potential abuse of a dominant position because of the rules that they have in their contracts and what data you might be releasing to them. This goes extremely far relative to others, and one might not want to have that. But I think the problem that we're seeing in this context is that from the point of view of the companies who are out there, the worst outcome they're fearing at the moment is that actually these issues aren't going to be resolved at the European level, and therefore for the whole of the markets that they're involved with, but rather in different ways with different regulatory regimes. And virtually all of the companies I've been talking to kind of in the digital area are companies that fear different regulation much more than bad regulation, in the sense that if you have one country with really good regulation and there are lots of large countries with bad regulation, and the differences are far more costly for them for compliance than other ones. That's true for competition policy. It's true in other areas. One of the things that impressed me on one occasion when we had a discussion about the problems of venture capital in Europe, there were some venture capitalists there who would say, well, we know how to evaluate technological risk. Our problem is we don't know how to evaluate regulatory risk, especially coming from 28 different jurisdictions. I think in that kind of context, two things are really important. You actually, in order to attract investments, you want to be similar as everybody else in order to get the impression of a more or less unified market that makes it worthwhile for investing. And secondly, you want to have some influence in order to push the implementation of rules and competition rules that are actually very similar all over the world these days, but push that type of implementation towards the direction that you're interested in. And so far, we've been having that type of compromise. Through a lot of delegation to the individual countries, we've actually had a drifting apart in competition policies, and it's leading to outcomes in recent cases like hotel platforms, in questions of digital regulation and so on, that look very different. And that's the biggest worry of people who are exporting from outside or trying to invest in Europe and seeing that kind of environment. Not to mention for European firms who see themselves strapped between different types of regulations. State aid control is the typical thing where countries generally have an interest that everybody is controlled in order not to have beggar my neighbor policies. But whenever someone controls you, you say this is a terrible interference in the individual market. The strange thing about the debate for someone who's seen it from the European side is actually that in terms of state aid control, And the types of policies the Commission implements, the Commission is actually much closer to UK culture in a lot of these regulatory matters than, for example, Germany. If we're just looking at regulatory implementation, also in state aid, when I was there, we went through this whole process of state aid modernization. What happens at the European level is extensive impact assessment, and what's been going through everywhere on European regulation is also our requirements of ex post evaluation of policies, kind of a framework that's much more kind of information-based, as a lot of the UK is, than, for example, Germany, that basically doesn't do anything in terms of impact assessment whatsoever. When we kind of take that out of the equation, I think we're going to get much more convergence towards the German model that's becoming more and more dominant, and that's actually not necessarily in the interest of the UK, since that basically means a lot of controls that you would have on subsidies, which Germany incredibly likes. I think it's the country that's most efficient in using all possibilities of subsidizing whatever they can under the rules, is going to prevail. And the one country that has always kind of fought against restrictions on their subsidization of an otherwise anyway strong industry has been Germany. I think you see some of these things in, for example, electricity. Some of the discussions one sees when one is kind of on the European side of this seem really strange. For example, when we're thinking about when there were the issues about nuclear new installations that went through state aid control, there were some discussions of how the Commission wanted to subsidize nuclear. There were other discussions about how restricting what the UK wanted to do was a problem. This was a typical case in which the political decision was that the views in the member states and all across were so diverse that this should not go into a general rule set, because you could not impose something general overall. But at the same time, you had to look at every case because energy is such an important factor that can influence the general national costs in competition, that those distortionary issues had to be dealt with. As they had to be dealt with in a fair way in Germany, where the subsidization led to a lot of external effects on Poland with redirected electricity flows, for example. So I think one of the things that seems to be absent from some of this debate is simply the fact that others behaving in certain ways that go to the common rules might be of much greater importance sometimes than the own flexibility in the rules, because generally those industries that are driving growth at the moment benefit from uniform regulations rather than a vast mosaic of regulatory structures that we're more and more convergent towards. Thank you.
So I want to talk about the regulatory powers and their nature. In particular, although they're being dealt with elsewhere, how environmental standards affect utilities. One of looking particularly at the benefits and burdens, and ending up with a word on social policy. So the EU, in the range of economically regulated utilities, exercises soft regulatory powers. So it doesn't have power to regulate utilities directly. The agencies, the regulators, report to the UK Parliament and assemblies, not to Brussels. But of course there are directives which come from Europe and are implemented through member state legislation. We heard earlier on that we shouldn't say that capped phone and text charges between member states are attributable to the EC, so perhaps I should stand corrected on that. And we had another example, I thought it was really, we had another example this morning of passenger compensation and how that I certainly, I'm afraid, benefited several times from that for air traffic delays, or for air delays, have come through Europe. So there is direct influence from Europe, I believe. Kauve's already talked about energy. EC has used competition law as a quasi-regulator in some senses. For example, some years ago, getting the German energy suppliers to reorganize themselves in a way that in other places might have been done by a regulator. But the environmental rules really do affect utilities, and here it really is, I think, benefits and costs. If we have common environmental goals, we clearly need to have global cooperation if it's a global pollutant, such as greenhouse gases. So huge benefits to have our hands tied in effect, because then we can come up with a solution that's better for everybody, and we won't have the kind of beggar my neighbour policy that Kauve has referred to with respect to state aid. But that doesn't really take account of local preferences for local pollutants. So it may be that individual countries have a taste for more polluted rivers. You can always, of course, have a higher standard than the EC standard. But we might want, perhaps my role as a non-executive director of Ofwat makes me feel that one might, for example, want to have dirtier beaches or dirtier rivers. And so something like the Thames Tideway Tunnel, which is very expensive and arises partly because of European standards, might not have been chosen. I suppose there the question is, are the local preferences always the best? I guess as an economist I want to say they're probably better than any others you could identify. So I think in terms of global pollutants, it's great to have these costs imposed in the sense that it benefits all of us. I think there are more questions over local pollutants. What about gains and constraints of cooperation? And they're very general, but they apply just as well in the utilities. Clearly there are gains from trade which can provide a potential for everybody to benefit, for example through lower prices. But then we find that we have influence over whether we're allowed to support particular kinds of electricity generation. This is just our local nuclear power station at Sizewell. And it imposes limits on the employment policy. And you might see that in the regulatory context in Royal Mail, and you might see it more generally at the moment in steel. And I want to end on talking about social policy, because the utilities are highly politicized, especially energy. And what we've got here is a graph of the proportion of expenditure by households. Kauve has already talked about the importance of energy in industry and commerce, but if we look at household expenditure, and you focus particularly on the blue line, I'm not quite sure why it's blue, but it is. This is the energy expenditure in the UK for people with different levels of income. So as income rises to the right-hand side of this chart, you can see that the proportion, that blue line falls, the proportion of energy expenditure falls as income rises. Put it the other way around, low-income households spend a much higher proportion of their household income on energy, and prices are driven up both by sustainability and environmental concerns, and some of these will come from a European context. The issue is, if we have a single market, we can perhaps reduce the overall level of prices, and so that might be beneficial, clearly, but what about the social policy, which is the prerogative of member states, who may prefer to apply particular social policies, in particular for these low-income households. So we might have limits on local subsidies from the EU, even though we have pressure on the overall level of prices. So I probably haven't answered the question. There are arguments on both sides, I think. Thank you very much.
I suppose the first thought here is financial regulation is global. It's not going away, whether it's the EU or some other regional grouping or some form of free trade arrangement. A very significant portion, the dominant elements of financial regulation are now coming from the Basel Committee, from the Financial Stability Board, and through various forms of global standard setter. Now within those groupings, of course, the UK is individually influential, but it also sits within the EU caucus, which is increasingly influential in these gatherings. But I suppose what's distinct then, if regulation in itself is not distinct to the EU market, What is distinct is the liberalisation passport, payoff if you like, which has been mentioned already, and which of course does attract third country actors to capitalise subsidiaries and voluntarily opt in to the EU rule book. And I think we're familiar with that a bank, an investment firm, stock exchange, once based in the EU, gets access to the huge EU market. But I thought I'd just perhaps note how dynamic this is. The passport is a very evolutionary concept. So if we look, for example, at the passport for prospectuses, so this is the document, the disclosure document that a company, if it's seeking funding in a market, must provide. That is regulated by the EU, and there is a passport, but it's currently going through an EU-wide deregulation. So you do get this dynamism, this innovation in the EU passports. Secondly, the targets of passports evolve and change. We've recently had, since the crisis, a series of new passports for investment funds. So passports for long-term investment funds, for venture capital, for social entrepreneurship funds. Now they do need tweaking, they didn't quite get it right first time around, but it's an example, I think, of how the notion of the passport is highly dynamic and it does respond to market conditions. So again, just sticking with this thought of the enhancement from the EU context, there are of course the international benefits and the agreements, the reciprocal arrangements which the EU, negotiating as a bloc, can organise for financial services. And aside altogether from the simple legal mechanics of this, the EU derives international power from its position as a bloc. So for example, and it's quite an old example but still a very important one of the biggest challenges UK corporates had for a long time in accessing the US market was the requirement to reconcile their financial statements to US accounting systems, to US GAAP. Now, once the EU as a bloc took on international financial reporting standards, which is the other big accounting language internationally, it had huge negotiating power with the US, which ultimately led to the US accepting company accounts, written, if you like, under IFRS. And I think a third international benefit that is quasi-legal, if you like, is the branding effect. So the UCITS fund, which is the legal construct, the regulated European investment fund, it's a legal concept. But the UCITS is a very strong label internationally in terms of quality of regulation, particularly in Southeast Asia. So these are some, I think, of the enhancements that follow simply from being regulated within the European bloc. Now, of course, European regulation will apply to a financial services actor almost always, regardless of whether or not they access that market, whether or not they actually use the passport. Now, the UK financial services industry is highly diverse. Of course, it goes from very small one-man or one-woman financial advisors right up to the massive global financial services banks and providers. There are exemptions across the major measures here, although it is worth noting these are closing out in response to the financial crisis with the push to a single rule book. However, there has been, I think, a pretty striking movement over the last possibly 6 months in Europe to a much closer focus on proportionality. And as a lawyer, that's a very powerful development in EU financial services. So this very strong sense that rules must be reviewed for proportionality and how they interact in particular in national financial systems. Probably the most famous example here is the reopening of the bank bonus rules and whether they should be relooked at again in light of the proportionality analysis. I think another enhancement from the EU context is simply process. Financial regulation is extraordinarily complex, difficult and highly politicised in terms of reaching good outcomes. But since the crisis in particular, the EU's process for adopting financial rules has become much more sophisticated, more transparent. There are more access points for interested parties to affect legislation, in particularly through the European supervisory authorities. So in terms of a second group of very quick thoughts, what might be the legal implications then of a post-Brexit scenario if there are some of the features of the single market? I think from a purely legal perspective, there's one important point. Whether it's good or bad, the operating environment for a financial firm will change, and that will simply bring legal costs and uncertainty costs, which can be resolved, but it's simply a change in the operating environment. And this is in particular because a huge or a very significant portion of EU financial regulation is in the form of EU regulations. So it's entirely dependent on the EU. So on day two, if you like, very significant parts of UK law will simply fall away unless there is a determination to retain those rules. It will simply have no force because that's been a consequence of the crisis. So that will need addressing. And a second consequence in terms of the operating environment is what to do with the soft law, guidance, templates, FAQs, best practice, this sort of thicket of market guidance that governs so much of the financial markets across the EU, and which does bring costs, but which also plays to economies of scale and certainty, which is coming from the European supervisory authorities. Again, in a sort of a post-Brexit scenario, what might the UK do in terms of rejigging or recalibrating its financial services rulebook? Well, as I've mentioned, choices will have to be made because the regulations fall away, but we are in an international market. The Basel Committee is not going away, neither is the IMF, neither is the Financial Stability Board. And most importantly, there is the equivalence decision. It does vary across different financial services measures, but a very significant portion of them do provide for an equivalence assessment for third country financial services providers to access the EU. Now, certainly as a matter of formal regulatory equivalence, or your rules equivalent, the UK would be in a very strong position because, of course, it has implemented, as a member of the EU rulebook, although, as I said, the regulations will require a formal response. But I think it's worth highlighting that equivalence extends beyond formal equivalence. Since the financial crisis, it also requires an assessment of supervision and of enforcement. Now, the European model for enforcement is pretty much based on administrative enforcement. That's what at the heart of the single market rulebook. But equivalence, as we all know, is political, it's not necessarily formal, and one couldn't necessarily confidently predict that equivalence would not become something of a political question vis-a-vis, are you using criminal sanctions sufficiently? Is your supervisory approach sufficiently tough? One might see how difficult scenarios might arise. And my final point is the UK in terms of the global financial environment. And here the point I would simply raise is the disjunction between the euro area and the single market. It is hard to see politically and economically the incentives that the EU would have not to raise concerns about the UK as a major centre for euro area trading. At the moment, a very significant portion of trading financial services in the euro happens out of London. It's a very important part of the city market. And at the moment, the dangers of location policies, for example, if you're trading in euro currency, you must be in the banking union, supported by the banking union structures within the SSM. The city is protected from that by a number of legal constructs, the treaty anti-discrimination provisions, specific requirements, in particular EU measures, governance and process voting rules in some of the European supervisory authorities, and finally the new settlement decision back in February. Political, yes, but important political statements about protecting the single market against the euro area. If the UK was outside the EU/euro area, speaking, I think the risk arises of sort of kicking away some incentives and ambiguities and tensions that are currently in the euro area single market dance, if you like, that do protect the UK as a centre for euro area trading, and it will be difficult to predict how that might play out in the future.
Now, I come at this from a legal perspective, not an economic one, but I want to offer some thoughts on how this works. I need to have 2 slides on some basics so you can understand the point I want to make. The first point is that UK labour law is territorial, so it applies to everybody on the territory of the United Kingdom, whether you are British, Polish or Pakistani with the right to work here. Furthermore, all of EU employment rights apply to everyone, provided that they fall within the personal scope, so you're an employee usually, and you've done the relevant length of service, and most of you will be aware of the fact that in order to bring a claim for unfair dismissal, you need to have 2 years service. Now, what's important for you to understand is most employment law is domestic. And what you have with EU law is essentially a top-up or supplement. And it's also a patchwork. It does not replicate all of the rules that you find at domestic level. It also operates as a floor of rights, so it sets minimum standards which states are free to improve upon but cannot go below, and that is crucial across all of this area of law. Now, the areas covered by EU law, as I say, are partial. And the part of the problem, part of the UK's antipathy towards EU regulation is that it's largely very un-British. And therefore, that's why this is where I do disagree here, because it's largely un-British, therefore it sits rather uncomfortably with our rather exceptional regulatory traditions. Our regulatory traditions have been, in the past, that most setting of employment standards have been done by collective bargaining, by trade unions negotiating with employers. The continental model is the state decrees what the rules are and imposes them on individual employers and workers. And that's why we have always had this uncomfortable relationship between the EU law and UK law. The one exception to what I've just said is equality legislation. And equality legislation looks very British indeed. Indeed, some of the key directives were drafted by British lawyers. That's why it looks very like British law. Where EU law goes further is in respect of the protected characteristics. So basically, UK law regulated only race, sex and disability discrimination. EU law came along and added to the pot sexual orientation, age, religion and belief. But the basic regulatory structure is very much what we are familiar with. Elsewhere on the slide, I've given you a brief overview of the areas where there has been EU regulation, EU intervention, what you'll notice from this summary is that there are gaps, and I'll tell you what the most obvious gaps are: unfair dismissal, redundancy, key areas of labour law, key employment rights that are the most commonly enforced in the UK, not touched upon at all by EU law. And that's what I mean, it's a patchwork. This supplements, complements, but does not replace all of UK law. So what we've seen is that in those areas where the EU is regulated, the UK and the other member states cannot go below those standards. And crucially, for that reason, because of this partial nature of the regulation, where the coalition government and now the Conservative government has been most active, are in those very areas which are not touched on by EU law at all. So the Trade Union Bill, which has just become an act, regulating trade union rights, the reforms to unfair dismissal law, and crucially, and most dramatically, the introduction of fees to go to an employment tribunal, which has led to a drop in cases by up to 70%. All of this has been regulated at national level, nothing whatsoever to do with EU law. Now, the one area that most people know, even if they have never given much of a thought to employment regulation, is the Working Time Directive, the bête noire of certainly the Leave campaign and quite a lot of people who would otherwise vote in favour of Remain. And so I just want to say something about the Working Time Directive, because it shows some of the issues that I have flagged up to you. So this is a TUC campaign poster which very neatly summarises the main rights in the Working Time Directive, most importantly the maximum 48-hour working week and 4 weeks paid annual leave. Small footnote there, 4 weeks paid annual leave introduced by the Working Time Directive. UK government, the coalition government, extended that to 5.6 weeks paid leave. So don't believe the rhetoric that all EU rules are bad and the UK government loads all social policy. We've actually gone beyond, as we're allowed to do, because it's a minimum standards directive. Now this is produced by the trucking industry, specifying all of the, in pragmatic form, the key rules and the particular adaptations of those rules to those who work in the commercial driving sector. Now, if you look at this and you think, my God, this is all the things that's bad about the EU. Look, they're prescribing how long coffee breaks should be. Look, they're prescribing how much rest you should get. This is over-prescriptive regulation, and worst of all, in terms of over-prescriptive regulation, 48-hour working week referenced over 17 weeks. Now, this is the real antithesis of the way the UK law has traditionally done it. There is a cultural divide here, because we, up until the Working Time Directive was implemented, we had no state law implementing or laying down rules on working time. Apart from for child workers and in very specific sectors, we had no legislation. There was no Act of Parliament on working time. And so this is culturally abhorrent to the British system, and that's why a lot of employers, and I should say workers, don't like it. So the problems with the Working Time Directive are the ones you've heard. It's culturally alien, it's seen as adding significant costs. Look at the NHS, doctors can't work more than 48 hours. It's seen as something of a straitjacket. And in particular, it's seen that the Court of Justice's interpretation of the directive has made it even more difficult to apply and even more culturally alien. For example, in calculating that 48-hour working week, that includes time spent on call but asleep on the employer's premises, so doctors who may be asleep on the premises, ready to be called at any time. That time constitutes working time, so clearly the clock ticks much more quickly up to the 48 hours. Now, in the 2 minutes that remain to me, what I just want to say is that although this directive is loathed and would be number one to go, I imagine, come a decision to vote to leave, it should be borne in mind that although the directive is seen as a straitjacket, actually, in some senses, it's quite a sophisticated piece of legislation. For example, although the headline is 48-hour working week, in fact, that 48-hour working week can be referenced over 17 weeks, so 4 months, 6 months, or 1 year. And in fact, apart from in the city and academics, most people do not work beyond 48 hours when referenced over 1 year. Furthermore, there's flexibility about when you start calculating that period. There are a lot of derogations in the directive, a lot of exceptions in the directive, except to the rule on annual leave. For example, autonomous decision makers, that's what Cambridge says we are as academics. Most of the rules don't apply anyway. Furthermore, quite considerable flexibility is introduced through so-called collective agreements, which are agreements between trade unions and employers, and newly introduced workforce agreements where there is no recognised trade union. And most famously of all, of course, you have the opt-out from the 48-hour working week, which nearly everyone who goes to work in the city signs on the same day as they sign their contract of employment. Unlawful under the directive, but nevertheless, that's what's going on. So in conclusion, what I'm saying is this area of law is more complex than would first appear. If there was a vote to leave, this will not be the end of employment rights as we know it, as the Remain campaign would have you believe, because, as I've said to you, quite a lot of employment rights laid down by EU law supplement what's already there at domestic level. But what we will lose is that floor of rights protection unless we decide to join the EEA, so doing a Norway, because Norway has implemented all of these social rights. Thank you very much.
When doing impact assessments in a narrow sense, you want to think about what alternatives there might be. What's the counterfactual? And you also want to think of how things might develop absent any particular measure that you consider. But if you're thinking of the single market as a whole, right, as a program as a whole. That's not really relevant. We could imagine all kinds of fantasies about how the world might have gone if the UK had never joined the single market. We could imagine all kinds of other ways in which you could have liberalised markets in Italy or Germany or wherever. But the fact of the matter is that the European Union mechanisms are the mechanisms that were chosen for delivering those things. So we don't need to think about fantasy alternatives. We just think about what was achieved by the measures that we used. And those measures have achieved a lot, in my view, and the UK's involvement in that has been very significant as well. We've particularly been significant in converting the European Union, particularly through the treaties and the European Commission, to a regulatory philosophy much more similar to ours than has been the case on the continent, for at least for most of the continent, for probably hundreds of years, based around the removal of state aid, competition, free trade, liberalisation of markets, privatisation, and other kinds of things amenable to us. At the same time, we've also had, as part of that, and at the same time, we've also had quite a lot of influence on particular measures. In fact, in many cases, what has happened is that we have had so much influence that we made everybody else, through the European Union directives and so on, do things our way. And one of the ways, I think that's one way in which the European Union gets a bad rap in the UK, precisely where we're most influential over what happens everywhere else, is where the European directive looks most similar to the UK thing before. So what happens is in the UK, everybody says, well, this is pointless, right? All we're doing is relabeling other stuff, so it's pointless red tape. And what they're missing is that it seems pointless to us precisely because we're making everybody else do things our way. Those kinds of influence, that achievement of opening up markets to others by making them do things our ways, creating regulatory convergence, and the influence we've had in converting people to our ways of looking at things, have been very valuable to us, enormously valuable. I could go through some numbers, but I won't take up your time unless you're asking about that later. However, gains that we've made in the past are not the same as gains that we might make in the future. It's just a mistake, I think, in thinking about the question of Brexit, to think, what have we gained? So therefore, has it been good to be in the EU up to now? So therefore, would we lose a lot if we left? Because when we come to think about the question of Brexit, we can't any longer play that trick of saying all that matters is what we gain through the particular regulations. Then we have to think about how would things go if we stayed, how might they go differently, and what might we do instead? So we have to think about those two kinds of things. Now, if we think about what might happen if we stay, it seems clear to me that we can't repeat a number of the gains that we've made. Obviously, once tariffs come down from 6%, 7% to 1%, you can't make the same gains again. You can't make the same gains again by converting others to your philosophy. And I don't believe that there's that much danger that if we left the European Union, its philosophy would change radically. Bear in mind the thought about the Germans taking over and so on, but it seems to me that a lot of this stuff is now hard-coded in the treaties, and they will find it very difficult to change their basic terms of reference. The other thing is that because we have this sort of semi-detached role where we're not in the Schengen area and not in the Euro and so on, we've become, I think, have already seen us becoming less influential than we were in the past, and that will accelerate much more in the future as some combination of what they want to do, and because it's such a cool idea, and the existential necessities of the Eurozone and the Schengen area. The Eurozone will draw more together politically. It will caucus, it will design single market regulations that serve its own needs rather than those of the broader EU. I think we already see that in financial services regulation, where if you think about things like up to 2005, measures like MiFID were very, very reflective of British philosophy. Subsequent measures, we've now been in a situation where we've had 4 major court cases challenging EU regulation. I don't know what other country within the EU has in the past 20 years found that it had 4 major ECJ cases where the state challenged EU measures in respect of their single most important sector. So it seems to me that that process is likely to accelerate, and what influence we've had, the gains that we've had through influence and through conversion we can't repeat, and in fact things are more likely to go in the other direction if we hang around and get in everybody else's way. Another thing to bear in mind is that certain sorts of regulation, it's clear what you want to do with a regulation, then there's an advantage to having a ratchet process. If what you're trying to do is get down tariffs or liberalise markets, things like that, it's quite good to have a process where you say, once I've done it, there's no going back, right? Because political forces and so on might tend to try to unpick things. But if it's not obvious what it is that you want to do in the future, it's much more dangerous to be subject to ratchets in that way and to lack the flexibility to try something, say, oh, that's a screw up, and do a quick U-turn. We've seen with this government, they're quite keen on doing lots of U-turns on various things. You'll find, I think, in the future that the types of challenges that we face in regulatory contexts, those to do with, say, the sharing economy or climate change or even new technologies that we've seen recently like vaping, seems to me that that what to do in respect of these things is not nearly so obvious as the regulatory challenges faced in the past. And there's if you have a ratchet process, you will either act before it's clear what to do and then find it difficult to go back, or you will not act quickly enough because of fear of being bound in by making a mistake. The flexibility that the UK could have by not being subject to that kind of ratchet, I think would be valuable to us in the future. There are other kinds of gains that we would make outside as well. So I think that we would make gains by finding new partners, that we could make gains by finding new partners that we converted to our regulatory philosophies again, enhancing global convergence. We could have new intimate partners where we formed new regulatory convergence arrangements with people that were very amenable to us. You could imagine partnerships with countries such as Canada and Australia, perhaps a new customs union, perhaps a new single market program, even a state building program with them. So when you think about what we would lose by leaving the EU, you can't merely in isolation think of us as unpicking the gains that we've made. You have to think, can we repeat those gains again? I say no. Might things go badly in the future if we stayed and we got in everybody else's way? Might it be better if we just got out of the way and let them do their thing? I say yes. Are there new people that we could make new deals with that would be different but create new opportunities which might be better for us in the future? I say yes. Are tomorrow's challenges in terms of regulation different from those in the past? I say yes. So it seems to me that there's every reason to suppose that we could get close, at least, to netting out the gains we've made in being in the single market in a regulatory sense if we were to leave and try something else in the future.